Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to the 10th and penultimate session of the 2019 Champlain Institute. For those of you listening online or at home, my name is Lynn Bolger and I help organize this forum of ideas. And I do mean help organize it. When Darren Collins, our present, was new to his gig, I would tell him not to thank the staff at events. And he looked at me as if, like, saying, "How rude, Lynn." But hear me out. So there we would be, a magical evening with rainbows and butterflies and craft cocktails and beautiful food and the reflecting pool and how gorgeous. And then he would start talking about the parking attendants and the people handing out name tags. And I would be like, this is supposed to be a bubble we're floating on. This is supposed to be all sparkle and glitter, and you have just popped the bubble. But when Ted Widmer pointed me out so embarrassingly on stage yesterday, I thought it's time to rip back the duct tape a little bit and tell you all how this forum is kept going with Bondo and bobby pins and duct tape. So is this going? The development office is tiny. There's about 6 of us, including our intern. But Wes and Caitlin and Amanda are logistical geniuses who have figured out all sorts of systems for communication and registration. They, along with Jen and Kenyon, have been working on this for months and months. And the level of detail they drill down to is crazy. Let me just say that yesterday there were 2 identical mugs under here for the speakers, Julian and John Wilmerding. And Caitlin not only had masking tape their initials on the mug, she asked if either one of them was left-handed so she could point the mug in the right direction. That is not normal, people. That is not normal. So Priam is our summer intern, and she has done such a fantastic job that we're encouraging her to drop out of school. But since she goes to COA, I have been sternly warned to stop this nonsense and let her finish her education. Zach and Davina in the sound booth deserve capes and super suits. They have been working day and night. I'm sure you've seen them there every day. And they are unflappable and kind. And when you're working 8 hours a week, kindness is bones in the morning and canapes at night. This is our kitchen. This is how we eat. This is not just for show. This is our kitchen. And many of the things that are served come from our own farms. So, and where in the history of gatherings do people rave about the parking? The people that greet you in the morning and in the evening are our buildings and grounds crew who have dropped painting duty and cleaning gutters and fixing dry rot to say, "Good morning, park over here." We love them. COA wants to keep the Institute free and open to the public to have an egalitarian discussion. And needless to say, this is not inexpensive to run. So the people who help support us also, we thank you, we thank you, we thank you. We often thank the Champlain Society members who give at this level $1,500 a year, and there are loyal supporters. But let me say, at every level, whether people give $25 or $100, it all matters, and we're so grateful to it. We couldn't do this without the support of a huge community. Which brings me to the volunteers, people ushering, opening their guest homes and apartments to keep the cost of the Institute down so we don't have to rent hotel rooms for the speakers. It's just been so amazing. There are people who host dinner parties for the speakers. It's just an amazing an army of people who help out with this. Further, the speakers themselves, They're here because Francis Steed Sellers roped in Catherine Collins and Julian Bell and Desson Thompson. Jody Goldstein tapped Neil, who tapped Julian. Christina Baker-Klein brought us in Bolo. Darren knew Bryn, who knew Susan Sarandon, brought them in. John Wilmerding got me to Ashley. Morgan Lavoie got me to Hannah. So it takes a huge amount of people and connections and work to get here, which is my segue into this morning's intros. Let me just say thank you to my staff, who I love you, and you make me look awesome. In the winter, I went to see John Wilmerding, who happens to be a trustee emeritus of College of the Atlantic, about his ideas for speakers for this institute. Hey, he's an art historian. You gotta bring it to me. He said, oh, that's not really my topic, but have some tea, have a biscuit. Let's talk about the island and the college, and let's gossip about the news. An hour later, I had a notebook full of ideas about people who I should asked to join us here this week. He told me, of course, about the Soul of a Nation show. Oh, you must include it. Of course, you already thought of that. I hadn't. It was at the Brooklyn Museum then, and in a week or so, it was headed to LA. So go see it. The Soul of a Nation show was organized by the Tate Modern in London, with more than 200 works by about 60 artists, responding to civil rights, black power, black feminist movements, major artists of the era. It left the Tate and went to Crystal Bridges in Arkansas, and this is where I started to see John's hand in it. John was the advisor to Alice Walton when she was building Crystal Bridges. And so from Bentonville, it moved to Brooklyn. The show is a tour de force, and I wanted a curator to speak about it, not just one of the artists included, but really somebody who had the intellectual framework for how it was put together. And so I started to stalk Ashley. It is not easy to find the people at the Brooklyn Museum. On the staff list, they don't have Ashley.@Brooklyn. So I lied and I called and said, hey, I'm returning Ashley James' call. Could you put me through? Don't try this at home. And then I get to some curatorial no man's land and I tried again and again. Anyway, here she is, but only after, when I called, I'm gushing on the phone, and she's thinking, who is this whack job from the 207? Is this real? I got her email address, start sending her official documents. And meanwhile, all the time I'm thinking, who do I get to sit with her? The chemistry for the conversations is so important. And so I'm sitting racking my brains in my daughter's apartment saying, we have this curator for the show. And my daughter's roommate says, I've seen that show. I'm like, you have? She's like, yes, I've gone through it twice with the curator. I said, Ashley James? And she said, yeah. And I'm like, you can't make this stuff up. Would you come? And she's like, oh my God, I would love to. So here we are. And for the record, Ashley came to the Brooklyn Museum from the MoMA, where Hannah is now. Ashley was a Mellon Research Consortium Fellow. She is now a PhD candidate in the departments of African American Studies, English Literature, and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Yale. She already holds an MA and an MPhil in English Literature, and an MA and an MPhil in African American Studies from Yale. Got that? She writes broadly on modern and contemporary literary and visual art practices, and her dissertation reconsiders the relationship between politics, art, and blackness in the late 1960s. Hannah is a 2017 graduate of Skidmore and was a Davis UWC scholar there. She was named as part of a rising new vanguard of black female curators by Now magazine. She currently serves as painting and sculpture 12-month curatorial intern at MoMA. She has curated several notable shows, including African Pop Studio and Of Ourselves in Toronto, and has served as the curator for Women of Color, Advancing Peace, and Security Art Forum. She has taught also at the Interlochen Center for the Arts. So please welcome Hannah and Ashley.
So before we start, I just wanted to say, like Lynn said, I saw the show more than once, and it was such a powerful and stunning experience. So I wanted to thank you again, and I'm really excited about getting started. So the organization of the show, for those of you who don't know, the top floor, it was on 2 floors, and the top floor was organized geographically, while the bottom floor was organized thematically. And when you walked through, it was very intuitive. But I was wondering whether this was an obvious choice for you, and if there was other organizational, other ways that you thought might work.
Thank you. Thank you to the Institute, to Lynn, who didn't say that not only am I difficult to find via email, but I'm difficult to respond to email. So thank you for persisting. And I'm so happy to be here. It's my first time in Maine. It's been a lovely, lovely time. I couldn't have asked for better hospitality and generosity, so thank you all for having me here. And thank you, Hannah, for the questions that you've written for today. Via that question of organization for Solvenation, I thought that would be a good segue into just giving an overview of what the show looked like and is about, so that when we get to the more specific questions, you'll have the kind of basis for the show. As Lynn mentioned, it began at the Tate Modern, organized by Zoe Whitley and Mark Godfrey. And a lot of times people, I think when it first happened at London, there was this question of why a show that is about American art would take place in London. And it seems counterintuitive, but it actually makes a lot of sense, because in the last, I would say, decade and a half, there's been an uptick in scholarship around this period, specifically around Black artists in the 1960s and 70s, a lot of which is coming out of the United States. So Solvenation is more a kind of accumulation of a kind of growing contingent around this period, rather than an anomaly. So the show still features over 150 works of art, over 60 artists. When I brought the show to the Brooklyn Museum, I have this, I really was thinking about what it meant for the show to find its home again in America, and specifically in New York. And one of the first things that I thought about was this idea of a regional categorization, because I figured that a United States audience would better understand the specifics of United States history. You understand what it means to be from the South, the Midwest, et cetera, in a way that someone in a European context perhaps could not. And given the fact that the floor plan came before the idea of how it'd be laid out, I knew that I had 2 floors, and so that was an opportunity for me to think of 2 theses, really, of the show, 2 different ways of looking at the same time period. So the show begins both chronologically and regionally. It begins in 1963 in New York with the March on Washington, which is the period right before Black Power proper, which is said to have begun in 1965. That's an example of one of the works in the show, Norman Lewis. It continues to some photography, which I think I'll talk about in a bit. We're still in New York. Roy de Carava figures heavily in the show. And then there's this kind of breaking point. It's literally a division between what is a kind of purplish wall color and the white that you see, which was a design element that offered a way of delineating the break between the civil rights movement and Black Power proper. Historians, of course, good historians would say that time is not even a progression, but it is all kind of connected, and you can't really think of separate movements as kind of complete wholes onto themselves, but at the same time, 1965 does offer a good way of understanding the beginning of Black power proper, and it's said to have started with the murder of an activist, the shooting of an activist named James Meredith, who was taking part in this civil rights action, and it became this kind of galvanizing event for activists and artists who realized, wait, legislative means of civil rights progress isn't going to get us there, so what are the alternatives? People were really grappling with what it meant to be an artist, activist, etc. Okay, so we moved through the South, New York, that's an Elizabeth Catlett, Los Angeles, one of Mel Edwards' masterpieces of his Lynch Fragment series. More Los Angeles. We moved to Oakland, which is primarily categorized by Emory Douglas. Chicago. Okay, and then we move downstairs. So you walk down a set of stairs, and Sam Gilliam's Carousel Change really introduces the next floor, which is more about innovations in painting, concepts of the period. In addition to the 1960s being Black Power, defined by Black Power and the anti-Vietnam War movement, environmentalist movement, second wave feminism, all of these things. There was also an aesthetic revolution afoot. This is the onset of conceptual art practices, performance art practices, minimalism. And here you have this kind of intersection between the radicality that's happening in the political realm and in the aesthetic realm. They're actually informing one another. So the second floor is kind of showing the ways that Black artists were also very innovative and experimental with materials. One of these key innovations being the removal of the stretcher and the suspension of the canvas, which is meant to kind of bring a person in greater relationship to a canvas, make a painting more immediate, all of these things. And this I can kind of just move through as we can go through the second floor. Yes, I'm just gonna keep on going while you can go on to your next
Okay.
Yeah.
So the death of both Malcolm X in '65 and Martin Luther King in '68 really energized the Black community, but artists specifically. Can you talk a little bit about how artists kind of grappled with this going on?
Yes, so I briefly mentioned that 1965 is kind of a breaking point. Let's get through this. Artists responded in various ways. 1965 is kind of considered the birth of the Black arts movement. So Amiri Baraka literally leaves his family in the Lower East Side. The East Village. He moves to Harlem. He starts the Black Arts Repertory Theater, which is said to kind of have started the Black arts movement as we know it. That was a kind of extreme response to the time. But artists responded in various ways. This is an example of a work by John Outerbridge called About Martin. A lot of artists do kind of memorial works in response to the assassination of political leaders. This is an assemblage piece that features various items that respond to Martin Luther King. Betty Saar is an artist who becomes more quote unquote radicalized. This is a masterpiece really of the period called The Liberation of Aunt Jemima, where she's taken this racist caricature, mammy figure, emblazoned her with the Black Power fist. You can see on the front there in the kind of the lower half quadrant, and she gives her a rifle. And it's kind of this declaration of not only Black power, but women as the leaders of a Black future, where this person is no longer servile and really kind of the liberator of a Black public. Yeah, there are a number of artists who point to the assassination of MLK and also Malcolm X as a kind of like come to Jesus moment. Like, what am I doing? What is the purpose of my work? Who is it for? And they either revise what they've been doing completely, or they continue the work that they do and kind of see that as a response to the period.
Yeah. Specifically on the first floor, I noticed that there were a lot of different groups that dealt with these kinds of issues in really different ways. A lot of the groups connected aesthetically or conceptually, and some meant to connect, and some and some connected just through the aesthetic or the concept. In your opinion, what do you think was the most successful strategy that any of these groups employed?
Yeah. So success looks, of course, different to different people. It's funny though. I did a bunch of tours for the show when it was up, and you begin. Sorry, there are a lot of slides. You begin with the first collective, a group called the Spiral Group. They were formed in 1963. Actually, they first formed to take a trip to the March on Washington. So there's always this kind of political goal attached to their collectivity. But in the aftermath, they decided that they kind of wanted to meet together to think about what a Black aesthetic would look like, a political aesthetic would look like. And they, being artists, did not agree on what that looked like. But they did agree on one thing, which in the closing year of their collective, they lasted for 2 years. In 1965, they mounted one exhibition called, the organizing principle was that they'd contribute work in black and white. Black and white having both aesthetic resonances and political resonances. So that's what you're looking at in this image is works that were contributed by multiple members that took up this monochromatic palette. And this is kind of an example of like artists coming together but still doing their own thing.
Yeah.
On the other hand, though, another collective which ends the regional floor is a Chicago collective by the name of Afrocobra. And Afrocobra, commune of bad relevant artists, bad meaning, 70s term of bad, bad meaning good, and they actually, I'm not sure if you can see from this image, but they actually did really agree on some basic aesthetic principles. Super bright colors, kind of kaleidoscopic mosaic style. They would integrate text in their images, this idea that art can have an embedded message. They thought that these bright colors, bold colors, were reflective of an African aesthetic, which is kind of like a separate topic of what Africa means to all of these artists is its whole other show. But I think that they were successful in agreeing upon what a kind of collective aesthetic could look like, which still allowed them to individually explore their own practice.
Right. So Tom Lloyd said, "My art is black because I'm black," and he believed that him making art was political in itself. And as you're saying, a lot of artists in the show would agree with that, and a lot of artists in the show would not believe in that. So what does political mean for the different groups of artists in the show?
And that is a key question. I would say that that's in some ways, I can't speak for the Tate curators, but that's certainly a question that, I don't know, dictates a million dissertations and will continue to, because politics, there are assumptions that are made about what political art looks like and what black political art looks like. And this show, I think, offers a way of complicating that and understanding political art to mean a lot of things. So Tom Lloyd actually made this piece, which is reflective of this kind of new interest in electronics as a new frontier of art practices in the early 1970s. This is actually 1965. But he himself said, as you pointed to, that he considers his work political because he's a Black artist making work, and so that has an impact no matter what. That is not something that every Black artist agreed with during the time. An artist like Frank Bowling didn't think that way. He argued for the fact that Blackness and his identity racially was separate from his practice. But anyway, you were asking me about political art. Political art looks different for everyone. This is Jack Whitten's Homage to Malcolm X, which is, again, another memorial work for an assassinated political leader, but it's completely abstract. So it kind of upends what we think a political piece could be, but he's clearly making a political statement in making that work. Barclay Hendricks is another one who would consider his practice as separate from politics in a sense, but when you think about the fact that when he was making this work, you know, in the early 1970s, Black artists weren't being shown in museums at all. Him insisting upon painting the Black figure and insisting upon displaying the Black figure has its own kind of political resonance as well. Yeah, and again, I evoke the many tours that I did when the show was up. But I often would say that Emory Douglas is, you know, considered perhaps the most political artist. Let me see. Oh, I'll talk about this. Emory Douglas, who was a minister of culture for the Black Panther Party, is considered the most political artist in that he's literally a propagandist for the Black Panther Party. You can't really get more political than that. But he also had a very sophisticated aesthetic sense. And by the same way, these more clearly kind of aesthetically interested works can also carry political content. I'll just briefly point to Dana Chandler's Fred Hampton's Door, which is another example of a political response to the moment. It's thought to be a kind of replication of the door that was broken into by the FBI, essentially ambushed Fred Hampton at 4 a.m. This is 1969, assassinating him with his pregnant girlfriend in the bed next to him. And it was like the assassination of Malcolm X and MLK was another kind of, it really was the death knell of the Black Power movement. It felt like a real blow as he was said to be the future of the party. So this kind of conceptual work, really, a recreation of that bullet hole ridden door is again a different kind of political art.
Right. I think Emory Douglas is also a perfect example of how art can be used to really push forward a movement and get the word out. So I think he's an amazing example. When we go downstairs, there's amazing examples of artists who are really experimenting, like you said. For example, David Hammons would paint himself with oil and actually use his body as a stamp, his body and his other people's bodies as well. What do you think this kind of experimentation has to do with the political and social climate at the time?
Yeah, I think that's also a good question. That is being worked out within shows, academia. So when I say that, you know, there are these kind of like parallel tracks of what's happening in the political context and what's happening in the aesthetic context, they actually do overlap because it's almost just like, I feel like a historian would have a better term for this, but radicality is in the air.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, even if you're doing a kind of anti-establishment, even if you're pushing back against aesthetic norms, that too carries political weight. Not so much David Hammons, but you know, in the case of Sam Gilliam, who removes the stretcher and suspends the canvas, I mean, that can be seen as an exclusively kind of aesthetic innovation, Overstreet is another artist who suspends the canvas, is what you're seeing there. But at the same time, when you think about the fact that art history has its own power,
Right.
it's very tied to state power, it's tied to all these things that we understand more clearly to be the stakes of politics, I guess. Doing a gesture like this is also pushing back on a kind of greater system. But what was the original question again? It was, oh yeah, how are they related? How is the
Yes.
innovation? And yeah, it's all of a period. It's a countercultural moment, and I think because so much was going wrong, that offered a kind of freedom to go wrong in your own practice too, and
Right.
just like try something new out and
Right.
kind of demand new answers out of staid values across multiple systems.
And someone who was really kind of supporting these artists who were experimenting was Linda Good Bryant, who started the gallery just above Midtown Gallery, Jam. And she supported all kinds of artists at the time. And I was just wondering, how important was Jam for Black artists? And how important are galleries like that today for artists, Black artists today?
Yeah, so just above Midtown was a commercial gallery, as you stated, Hannah, started by Linda Good Bryant. So during this period, it was very difficult as a Black artist to have gallery representation, to be represented in nonprofits, museums, and it was doubly so for experimental Black artists, because if a painter can't even get into MoMA, the Met, what have you, then certainly like something made of paper and nylon pantyhose is not getting into any of these institutions. So Linda Good Bryant, who really was a visionary, is a visionary, she was 24 years old, something like that. And she decided that she would start a commercial gallery because she recognized that, you know, these artists need to make money. And she wanted it to be in Midtown, which at that time was where the majority of galleries lived before kind of, you know, Chelsea and what we know now. So she focused on experimental works like by David Hammons, who is largely recognized to be one of the most important American artists of the 20th century, but certainly was not recognized during that period. This work is called Bag Lady in Flight, which is a greasy paper bag that he's unfurled to approximate this kind of aerodynamic figure. It's beautiful, it's very poetic, a good indication of kind of his practice, which is about elevating the materials, the detritus of urban life to the status of fine art. And so she saw the value in this, which, you know, that's how art history is made. It was in existence for about 10 years. She also showed a lot of performance art, which is such a difficult medium to support. It's a difficult practice to make a living doing, still to this day, so certainly then it was. So yeah, I mean, she's a good reason why we come to know even the limited amount of artists that we do now, because she saw the foresight in supporting them then. And that, oh yeah, this has been announced, that this show is going to be at MoMA as well, on just above Midtown.
Yes,
It was announced.
Sorry. I was scared for a second. Yes. She's finally getting kind of the excitement and honor that she deserves. For example, at Frieze Art Fair, there was a couple Jam booths as well, which was really exciting. Yeah. You mentioned the detritus that people like David Hammons used and kind of elevated. On the first floor, there was also the section with artists who made assemblages and other sculptures. And I was wondering what you thought about their use of detritus and, you know, maybe the practical, aesthetic, thematic reasons for using those kinds of materials.
Yes. So that is in the Los Angeles section. And that's actually great because it's a way of me saying that in the regional organization of the show, any organizational principle is going to be limiting. But at the same time, what's useful about the regional organization is that you do get a sense, even if it's a limited sense, of the differences that come out of these specific regional contexts that artists work, which carry long histories of Black life that inform their practices. So in the case of Los Angeles, you see, and it's kind of difficult to see here, but you kind of turn this corner and you move from a room that's primarily painting and sculpture into these kind of wacky assemblage sculptures that look very different materially. And that's because LA is, artists also did drawing and painting, etc. But it was also a space where assemblage was a kind of alternative to the kind of polished idea of sculpture that we retrieve from New York. Los Angeles, I think for many artists, not only Black artists, offered this kind of freedom of experimentation, which is being away from New York is a double-edged sword. You don't get the attention that New York does, but it also allows you to just be a little bit more experimental in your approach. Assemblage was a way for Black artists to think about the afterlife of materials, recognizing that you can find value in everyday kind of things that would otherwise be discarded. This work by Noah Purifoy called Watts Riot is actually made of the detritus of the Watts Riot that he then reconstituted into a work, which is a great kind of symbol of the moment in saying that out of the fire and the ash, literally, will arise something anew. For Black artists, whenever I mention this point, I always cite Kelly Jones, who is an art historian who is so key to the 1960s and 70s and how we come to understand this moment. She also makes a point about assemblage for Black artists as being related to this African American practice of making do with what one has. If Black families are making their way to LA by way of the Great Migration, the Second Migration, then they can only bring so much. They only have access to so many things. So this idea of recycling is the intersection of environmentalist ideas, but also just Black cultural ideas and art historical ideas all into one.
You mentioned as well that Barclay Hendricks was one of the artists who was possibly political just because he represented the Black body when most people weren't. And actually at Barclay Hendricks, blood was chosen to be the media image for the show. So I saw it everywhere. It's a stunning image, red. I was wondering why specifically you chose that piece and whether it has a specific meaning to you or...
It does, and it has a theoretical meaning, but it also has a quite practical one, which points to just how it's kind of like a meta conversation around how exhibitions come to be. I actually saw blood at Prospect New Orleans, which is a what is it? What would you even call Prospect New Orleans? One of these, not a fair. It's not even. I guess it's every 3 years, triennial, that takes place, obviously, in New Orleans, across the city. Here it is. And I loved it, and it just so happened that Barclay Hendricks couldn't travel to Brooklyn, so I had to replace a work. And so I requested this after having seen it and became the signature. So Barclay Hendricks... And that's just to say, so the meta conversation is to say that, these things happen serendipitously,
right.
like us coming together.
Yeah.
But also is the result of a network of investment in Black art. So Dr. Montague, Kenneth Montague owns this work, and he's been such a champion of Black art, which is how that work could have even come to Prospect, New Orleans by way of Trevor Shoemaker, who's another very important curator to this history. Okay, and so conceptually, Barclay Hendricks' Blood is really important to me because I am very invested in breaking down these boundaries between abstraction and figuration, which is a dichotomy that I think has and is overemphasized within the discourse of Black art. And that's quickly, it's not that complicated. It's basically, people who say that Black artists felt impelled to create figurative work during this period as a way of representing Blackness in the absence of positive images of Black people, versus artists who wanted to do abstract painting, abstract works. I've mentioned to at least one person here that I think all work is abstract. So I don't really see it that way, but in any case, this offers me a good way of kind of forwarding that thesis, because Barclay is obviously making a figurative work. He would do landscapes and some more kind of conceptual works, but these kind of figurative portraits are his signature. But at the same time, you see that he's invested in all of these, what we'd consider more abstract kind of techniques and questions in his portraiture of Donald For-Me is the name of this person. So the monochromatic background of the red and the way that the figure just pops up against that is all about kind of perception, opticality, depth of the plane, all of these things. Even the plaid kind of patterning on his suit is so much thinking about abstraction. If that's not abstraction, what is?
Right.
And he's also using, it's hard to see here, but the figure really pops in person because he's using acrylic against oil, which allows for there to be this, or excuse me, the opposite. So there allows to be the sheen that really has it feel like the figure is kind of hovering over the plane. So it's just a beautiful work, and it's a good reminder that you kind of have to disavow these kind of distinctions that we hold on to in order to really access and appreciate what a work can do.
This piece is also a really good example of what a small world where we live in, because Kenneth Montague, who owns this piece, is also my mentor from Toronto. So it's just all comes together. So the Brooklyn Museum, obviously, you put together this amazing show that champions Black art, but the Brooklyn Museum has had actually quite a complicated history with Black curators and Black artists. How did you kind of come up against that, or did you come up against that when you were putting together this show?
I have to say, it was a very supportive environment for me. This show is, I guess, the first show that I curated on my own. And so it was a kind of big responsibility to give an assistant curator. But, I have to say that between like my direct mentor supervisor, Eugenie Tsai, and Pasternak, the director, were very open to what I wanted to do and kind of happy to hear my ideas and thoughts. Historically, though, when it comes to the museum, obviously the Brooklyn Museum was a working museum during this period, and working on this show, I felt like I had to address the history of the institution itself, which is how we get a small archival section, you can kind of barely see it, which traces the history of the Brooklyn Museum's community gallery, which was a space on the first floor of the museum that the museum created in response to protests by members of the surrounding Brooklyn community who asked the Brooklyn Museum, like, where are we in our community museum? Black artists who felt like they deserved a space at the Brooklyn Museum. And so in response, the museum created the community gallery, which had a very vexed history. And that's something that you see in the period writ large. One thing I didn't even mention was that another kind of through line of the show is art activism. So in addition to the work that artists were making, artists were also fighting to be shown at museums. The Black Emergency Cultural Coalition is formed in 1968 in response to a show at the Met that I won't get into that. But in any case, there were large spread protests across Manhattan and then also in Brooklyn in response. In the community gallery, though, even though they made this space, it was underfunded. It wasn't funded at all. So the director had to go out along Flatbush and try to get funding from just surrounding businesses. So there's a sense that, you know, on paper, we've given you something, but if there was no financial support for it at the same time. So, yeah.
Well, there was a lot of support for this show. And I know how I responded to the show, but I was wondering what kind of the overall responses to the show in Brooklyn, in London, everywhere was.
Yeah, I mean, the response was amazing. It obviously started in London. I will say that Anne had the foresight to bring the show before the reviews came in, so it wasn't a reactionary response by any means, but it had a great response, and I think that's for a lot of reasons. For many people, these artists are all new.
Right.
And so it was just like a huge kind of aha moment across 150 works. I think for someone like me who had already I knew there were maybe 2 artists in the show that I didn't know before working on the show. But I think for me, it was a revelation to kind of see all of these works together in a single space.
Yeah.
Like, that was the real yield for me. I think there were lots of responses. I mean, it's a heady moment. There's lots of responses around, like, the violence that permeates that space. I think there were lots of people who felt galvanized seeing how artists responded then and thinking about our own moment and kind of like the possibilities for artistic expression. One thing, though, that I think was a major yield art historically, and for me in particular, was like this painting piece, which I'm glad was able to kind of have its moment. Between the Sam Gilliam, this is a William T. Williams work, Virginia Jaramillo, Alma Thomas, the Frank Bowlings. I think that this history is a little bit lesser known. Again, folks like Kelly Jones has been working on this for a long time, but at the same time, I think seeing how much painting innovation was happening during this period, I think is a real key takeaway. That it wasn't all figurative work that's coming out of this time, that artists were working in really expansive ways.
It was also, for me at least, such an amazing opportunity to see all these works in person, because that doesn't happen as often as I would personally like.
Oh, yeah.
And speaking of seeing these works in person, I was wondering what came out of this show. Like, what's going to happen next?
Yeah, so the show is, I think it's still up at the Broad, I think. It's traveling to 2 more venues, and that's one afterlife of the Tate Show. Another is representation for artists. For anybody who kind of follows art news, insular art news, Sam Gilliam recently, for the first time, got New York representation. He's in his late 80s, I think, if not early 90s. Artists like Fred Eversley, again, in 80s representation. Ed Clark, who's in his 90s, also was picked up by a gallery. It's a good thing, but at the same time, it's like, it's also very sad to see, because you realize that artists who've been working for 5, 6 decades saw their entire careers go by without recognition. And it's actually a very humbling thing to work on a show like this, because you realize how much market power shows carry. And, you know, it's wonderful that in these later years, these artists, if not themselves, their families will be the beneficiaries
Right.
of their work receiving this kind of attention. But at the same time, it really is, for me, it's like a charge to consider what we're doing now.
Yeah.
Because that's not a happy story to see an artist at 92 get gallery representation. Because, I mean, yeah, I won't even get into the politics of that. But that is one thing that's happened after. And another thing, another good thing is like the other exhibitions that come out of a show like this. Because it's so huge, the show can only do so much and can only, bring in so many people, but B, show so many works from a single
Right.
artist. So offshoots of this exhibition are things like just above Midtown having a retrospective. Lorraine O'Grady, who's a featured artist in the show, is having a retrospective at the museum, which is fabulous. The museum, Brooklyn Museum too, did a show called We Wanted a Revolution, which also focused on this period. Are we at time? Oh, okay. And, oh yeah, here's Lorraine O'Grady. So yeah, new shows, representation. For me, I had the opportunity of working on an exhibition. I brought a couple of slides, it's actually closing on Sunday, by a young artist named Eric Mack. He's in the biennial. And after working and seeing these kinds of innovative painting practice, through a number of conversations, I was given the opportunity to bring a young Black artist. He's 31, you know, we're not bringing him in at 75 after he's had his whole career to do a site-specific installation. He's a textile artist who works at the intersection of fashion, painting, sculpture. So he did this suspended cotton fabric hand-dyed piece in another space in the museum, which to me felt like a great kind of yield of a show like Sullivanation, to give further due to the artists in the show, and then to also say, like, never again we're going to start supporting artists when as early as we can.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to thank you so much, Ashley, for
Thank
letting me
you.
pick your brain. And thank you to Lynn so much for allowing me to be a fangirl.
I think we have time for a couple of questions from the audience if you'd like to, but please wait for the microphone. Yeah.
Thanks so, is that on? Thanks so much. It was that very, very stimulating conversation. My question is about the Black Lives Matter movement and art you're seeing emerging from that, and how you might see yourself curating a show 20 years from now based on that art, what it would have derived from this moment. And if you could think about that for us, it would be great.
That's a good question. You know, I think that this period is also part of what I was pointing to in the kind of dialectic between the second floor and the first floor, and thinking about the formal alongside the political, is that every artist lives in the aftermath of conceptual art, and what conceptual art offers a contemporary artist to approach something via ideas as opposed to like representation. And I actually think that in this period, many Black artists and many just artists in general are doing works of art that are more historical, that are looking at long histories of exploitation, racism, sexism, colonialism. Some people say that like I guess the 80s is considered the historical turn in contemporary art. But I do think that artists are occupying this kind of refractive position. I'm thinking about a number of artists, for instance, in the Whitney Biennial, a number of Black artists who are taking up kind of long-standing histories and reconstituting that in aesthetic practices. An example of that is an artist, Tamashi Jackson, who is an abstract painter, but she integrates these elements of the archive. So for her project there, she focused on the Black community that used to occupy Central Park before they were evacuated for, for this governmental public gesture. And in doing so is kind of like, is saying that we're occupying this long chronology of racial tension, exploitation. But Black Lives Matter, yeah, I feel like it's so changed the way that conversations are had, that it's hard to point to like how it's been made visible aesthetically, as opposed to saying like Black artists in general are being looked at more. Black artists feel empowered to speak about race more in kind of these kinds of indirect ways. I don't know that I could point to what is a Black Lives Matter aesthetic that has emerged. Do you think so, Hannah?
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think there's a lot of art coming out of the Black Lives Matter movement, but I don't think it's necessarily. I think it's more them being inspired by the kind of activism. But yeah, I would agree with you on that.
Phil?
Thank you very much. This was really spectacular. Actually, it was quite powerful. And my question has to do about, as a collection, it's powerful. And as these Black artists' work become integrated into the global art world, do you think they will lose their power as individual works or gain more power?
You mean when they're seen outside of the context of an exhibition like this?
Exactly.
I don't know that if it's, I see any new context as a gain, because that's how we come to appreciate art in new ways. I definitely think that's something that is a goal of a show like this. This is one context to see it, and now it's everyone's duty to revise art history and how we understand it. Again, there are many art historians who have long seen this history as a part of American art history, global art history, but it is a demand for that to be more largely understood. But yeah, I think that is kind of what is so bizarre in watching the press releases come out around gallery representation for these artists, where it's kind of like, now the superlatives come out about how the best and one of the most, and there is that recognition there, but it's a reminder that art history is subjective and political, and that you kind of have to fight for your space in art history, as it were. But yes, a number of these artists have been recognized in various ways as kind of masters of American art, for sure. Some more than others, and hopefully more than has been.
More question?
Could you say something about the kinds of folks that this show brought in? Was it different from kind of people who normally go to museums? Was the show an attractive force for Blacks, whites, whoever?
I think so. We didn't collect data that kind of disaggregated according to race or anything like that. So what I know is more, anecdotal, and coming in on a weekend and kind of seeing a diverse crowd, diverse age-wise, diverse racially. Yeah, the Brooklyn Museum actually attracts a more diverse crowd than other museums in the city. So that's kind of already a part of the mission and the way that we understand ourselves. But yeah, I hope that the show was appealing to people from various backgrounds. Certainly a number of different types of people wrote about it or spoke to me about it, these kinds of things. Lots of school groups.
Also, I feel like for a Black curator or artist or creative, or even just a Black person who appreciates art, when you go to museums, it's very rare to see someone who looks like you on the walls. And so to go to the Brooklyn Museum and see photographs with a Black woman in it or a painting with a Black woman in it is really powerful. And I know that the people I've spoken to about the show really emphasized that as being really important and being something that brought them to the show.
It is a great segue into announcing tonight's talk with Julian Zugazagotia and Judith Goldstein, who will talk about the role of museums and the changing roles of museums tonight. That's at 5 p.m. Right now is your last chance to buy books. We won't have a book sale this evening, but please thank our guests today, Ashley
Thank
and
you.
Hannah.